Luca Brooks tightened his grip on the worn leather steering wheel of his cab, his knuckles whitening as he took a deep breath. The city of Chicago stretched before him, its skyline shimmering against the late evening sky. His shift had started at sunrise, and now, as the night settled in, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. He rolled his shoulders, trying to shake off the tension. The meter blinked, signaling the end of his latest fare. He glanced at the back seat in the rearview mirror. Empty again. It had been a slow night. Too slow. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, lighting up with a name he knew all too well. Mr. Donovan. Luca hesitated. He knew exactly why his landlord was calling. The rent was due, past due. He could already hear the man's sharp voice, reminding him of the final warning from last week. He let it ring. A moment later, a text popped up. 3 days. That's all you got. After that, you're out. Luca exhaled through his nose, gripping the wheel tighter. 3 days. He barely had enough to cover gas for the week, let alone rent. His phone lit up again. This time a different name. Lucas, his son. He reached for the phone, swiping to answer. Hey, kid. Are you almost home? Lucas's voice was tight, careful. Luca could hear the frustration beneath it. Soon, he said, though they both knew that was a lie. A pause. Then, you said that last night. Luca shut his eyes for half a second. I know, I just need a few more rides. I promise. Lucas exhaled. Fine. I'll pick up some food on the way. Another pause. Don't spend money on me. Just come home, okay? Luca's throat tightened. I will, he said. But the words felt empty. The call ended, and Luca stared at the glowing screen until it dimmed. The cab suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. Outside, Chicago moved on without him. Couples walked hand in hand under glowing streetlights, their laughter floating in the crisp autumn air. Office workers hurried to catch the last train home. The city was alive, vibrant. But for Luca, it felt like he was trapped beneath it, drowning in its shadow. He had to do something. His eyes flicked to the glowing green light at the intersection ahead. A choice. He could turn right, head home to Lucas, tell him they'd figure something out. Or he could turn left, back into the city, hoping for just one more fare, one more chance to scrape together what they needed. The light turned yellow. Luca made his decision. He turned left. The rain started an hour later. It was the kind of downpour that turned the streets into mirrors, neon signs reflecting off puddles in fractured colors. Luca's wiper struggled against the sheets of water, and the rhythmic slap of rubber against glass filled the cab. He drummed his fingers on the wheel, scanning the streets for his next fare. The app had been silent for the past 20 minutes. People didn't want cabs in this weather. They wanted to be home, dry and warm. His stomach twisted at the thought of his own home, the one slipping further away with every passing hour. He was about to call it when something caught his eye. A sleek black SUV sat on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking in the dark. The figure of a woman stood beside it, a flimsy coat doing little against the downpour. She was on the phone, pacing in short, agitated movements. Luca hesitated. It wasn't his problem. But then he thought of Lucas, of how he wanted to teach his son that they weren't the kind of people who turned away when someone needed help. With a sigh, Luca flicked on his blinker and pulled up behind the SUV. The woman turned, startled, gripping her phone tighter. He rolled down his window, rain instantly creeping in. "Flat tire," he called over the sound of the storm. She hesitated, eyes scanning him with a mixture of wariness and relief. "Yeah," she said, her voice clipped. "Roadside assistance is taking forever." Luca nodded, already pushing his door open. The rain hit him instantly, soaking through his jacket, but he ignored it. "No need to wait," he said, moving toward the trunk. "I can change it for you." The woman's brows lifted. "In this weather?" Luca smirked, kneeling beside the tire. "I've done worse." She watched him for a beat before shaking her head, stepping under the awning of a nearby storefront. "You're either a saint or completely crazy." Luca grinned. "Depends on who you ask." 15 minutes later, Luca stood, shaking out his rain-slicked hands. The spare was on, secure. He wiped his forehead, pushing wet strands of hair back. The woman stepped forward, inspecting his work. "That was fast." "Not my first time." Luca wiped his hands on his jeans. She pulled out her wallet, thumbing through crisp bills. "Let me—" "No need," Luca cut in. "Glad to help." She frowned, studying him. He realized then how he must look. Soaked to the bone, his jacket old and threadbare, exhaustion lining his face. "At least let me give you a ride," she said. "You're drenched." Luca hesitated. "I've got my cab." "Then let me pay for the repair or buy you coffee, something." He shook his head. "Seriously, just pay it forward." Her frown deepened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she pulled out a business card, holding it out to him. "In case you ever need a favor." Luca took it, glancing at the name. B. Harrington. The name pricked at something in his memory. He'd heard it before. B seemed to notice his recognition, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "Drive safe, Luca." He watched as she climbed back into the SUV, the engine roaring to life. Within moments she was gone, taillights disappearing into the rain. Luca glanced at the card again, then tucked it into his pocket, shaking his head. Just another night in Chicago, or so he thought. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time Luca pulled into the gas station. He let out a slow breath, watching the neon lights flicker against the wet pavement. The cab's engine hummed beneath him, a low reminder of the hours he still had ahead. He checked the meter. Not enough. Not nearly enough. His fingers brushed against the damp fabric of his jeans, where B. Harrington's business card sat in his pocket. He hadn't looked at it since she'd driven away, hadn't let himself dwell on the moment. But now, alone in his cab with nothing but the quiet buzz of the city around him, his curiosity got the better of him. He fished out the card, turning it between his fingers. The thick paper and embossed gold lettering screamed money. B. Harrington, CEO, Harrington AI Technologies. Luca exhaled sharply. That's where he had heard the name before. The woman he had helped was one of the most powerful tech executives in the country. She was in the news all the time, one of those self-made millionaires who had built a company from the ground up. His mind raced. Why was someone like her stranded on the side of the road with a flat tire? Didn't people like her have drivers, assistants? More importantly, why had she bothered to give him her card? His phone buzzed on the dashboard. He grabbed it quickly, expecting to see Lucas's name, but it wasn't. It was Mike. "Hey, man," Lucas said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You still out?" Mike's voice had that usual tired edge to it. "Yeah." "You eat yet?" Luca almost laughed. "You offering?" "You know I got you." He hesitated. He didn't want charity, but he also hadn't eaten since the stale gas station sandwich at noon. "Fine, I'll meet you." He ended the call and pulled out of the station, heading toward their usual late-night spot. Mike was already there when Luca arrived, 2 paper cups of coffee sitting between them on the worn metal table outside the all-night diner. The smell of grease and freshly brewed coffee mixed with the cool night air, a scent Luca had come to associate with exhaustion and comfort in equal measure. "You look like hell," Mike said, handing him a coffee. "Feel like it." Luca took a sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. Mike leaned back, stretching his arms over the back of the chair. "So, what's the damage?" Luca rubbed his forehead. "Donovan gave me 3 days." Mike whistled low. "That guy's ruthless. No argument there." Luca stared at the coffee, swirling it absently. Mike eyed him. "You thinking about calling her?" Luca stiffened. "What?" "The woman. The one with the flat tire." Luca sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. I don't even know why she gave me her card. Mike smirked. Come on, man. She's obviously into you. Luca snorted. Yeah, I'm sure a millionaire CEO is dying to date a broke cab driver. Mike shrugged. Stranger things have happened. Luca shook his head. It's not like that. Then why are you carrying her card around like it's a winning lottery ticket? Luca didn't answer, because he didn't know. The next morning, Luca was jolted awake by the sound of his phone buzzing against the dashboard. He blinked, disoriented. Sunlight filtered through the windshield, and for a moment he forgot where he was. Then reality hit. He was still in his cab. Lucas must have already left for school. He grabbed his phone, expecting a missed call from his son. Instead, an unknown number flashed across the screen. Luca hesitated, then answered. Hello? Luca Brooks. He knew that voice. B. His stomach tightened. Yeah. I wanted to thank you again for last night. Her tone was polite, businesslike. Wasn't a big deal. Well, I think it was. A pause. Are you working today? Luca frowned. Why? I need a driver. He sat up straighter. You need a cab? No, she said smoothly. I need you. Luca was silent. I have meetings all over the city today. My usual driver is out. I figured I'd see if you were available. His mind raced. This was more than a cab fare. This was an opportunity. He thought about Lucas, about the eviction notice taped to their apartment door. Finally, he exhaled. Where do you need me? B rattled off an address in the heart of downtown. One of those high-rise buildings where people like her ran the world. I'll be there, Luca said, before he could overthink it. When Luca pulled up to the towering skyscraper, he half expected B to be waiting outside. Instead, the doors to the lobby swung open, and a woman in a sleek navy pantsuit strode toward him with sharp, purposeful steps. Not B. The woman stopped at his driver's side window, arching a perfectly shaped brow. You must be Luca. He nodded slowly. And you are? Ashley Coleman. I'm B's assistant. Luca glanced toward the building. She coming down? No. Ashley opened the back door, sliding into the seat behind him. You'll be taking me to her first meeting. She'll join us later. Luca frowned. I thought she needed a driver. Ashley's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Consider this a test run. Luca's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Great. A test. Of what, exactly? Ashley leaned back, crossing her arms. Let's go, Brooks. Time's money. Luca pulled away from the curb, his jaw tight. He had a feeling this was going to be a long day. Luca kept his eyes on the road, his grip firm on the steering wheel as Ashley sat in the back seat, arms crossed, watching him through the rearview mirror like a hawk studying prey. She hadn't said much since he pulled away from the curb, but the silence wasn't comfortable. It was weighted, deliberate. He had the distinct feeling she was assessing him, measuring every movement, every decision. So, she finally said, breaking the silence, how long have you been driving? Luca kept his tone even. Couple of years. Before that, worked in auto repair. Ashley hummed, unimpressed. So, you know cars? Yeah. Ever drive for someone like B before? He exhaled through his nose. No. She tilted her head, her gaze sharp. Then, why do you think she asked for you? Luca flicked his eyes up to the mirror, locking onto hers. I was wondering the same thing. Ashley let out a small laugh, but it wasn't warm. Honest, I'll give you that. Luca didn't respond. He didn't know what game she was playing, but he could feel the underlying challenge in her voice. She didn't trust him. The cab rolled to a smooth stop in front of a gleaming high-rise, the kind of building that screamed wealth. Ashley checked her phone, sighed, then finally leaned forward. Look, I don't know what kind of story you've got, but B doesn't just take random chances on people. She's calculated. She has a reason for everything. So whatever this is, don't get comfortable. Luca tightened his jaw, the words sinking into him. Ashley pulled open the door, pausing just before stepping out. Wait here. We won't be long. She disappeared into the revolving doors, leaving Luca alone with his thoughts. He exhaled, gripping the wheel. What the hell was he doing here? He should have said no. He should have taken the hint and walked away. But he hadn't, because deep down, some part of him wasn't ready to let this door close just yet. The passenger door opened suddenly, breaking him from his thoughts. Luca turned, expecting Ashley, but instead, Bea slid into the seat beside him. She was different from last night. No rain-soaked coat, no frustrated expression, just sleek confidence in a tailored suit. Her blonde hair swept back in a way that made her look effortlessly in control. "Morning," she said, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer. Luca blinked. "You're sitting up front." She arched a brow. "I like to see where I'm going." "Most people in your position prefer the back seat." "I'm not most people." Luca smirked, shaking his head as he pulled away from the curb. "Yeah, I'm starting to get that." The silence that settled between them was different from the one with Ashley. Less tense, more charged with something unspoken. Bea was watching him, and he could feel it. "You didn't hesitate," she finally said. Luca frowned, glancing at her. "What?" "Last night. You could have ignored me, driven past, but you didn't." He shrugged. "Didn't seem right." Bea studied him, something unreadable passing through her gaze. "Most people wouldn't have stopped." Luca kept his eyes on the road. "I'm not most people." Her lips curved slightly, just enough for him to notice. They drove in silence for a few blocks before she spoke again. "So, Ashley's made it clear she doesn't trust you." Luca huffed a quiet laugh. "That obvious?" "She doesn't hide things well." "She thinks I'm some kind of opportunist," he said, glancing at her. "Should I be offended?" Bea tapped her manicured nails against the window. "She's protective. And she's not wrong to be. I don't usually let strangers into my life, Luca." He let the weight of that statement settle between them before speaking. "Then why did you?" She didn't answer right away. Then finally, "Because I trust my instincts. And something about you." She trailed off, as if she wasn't sure how to finish that thought. Luca turned onto Lakeshore Drive, the city sprawling along the water beside them. He should have let the conversation drop, should have let her words sit without question. But something about her intrigued him. "Something about me, what?" he asked, pushing just enough. Bea glanced at him, holding his gaze a second longer than necessary. "I haven't figured that out yet." The way she said it made the air in the cab feel warmer, heavier. Luca swallowed, turning his attention back to the road. A second later, Bea's phone buzzed. She sighed, glancing at the screen before answering. "Yes?" He couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he could tell from her clipped responses that whoever it was, they were frustrating her. "That's not my problem," she said, rubbing her temple. "You should have handled it already." A pause. Her fingers drummed against her knee. "If they don't want to renegotiate, then tell them we're pulling the contract." Another pause. "Then make them listen." Luca didn't know much about business, but he knew power when he heard it, and Bea had it in spades. She ended the call with a sharp sigh, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I hate mornings," Luca smirked. "That bad?" "You have no idea." She leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a brief second. He wasn't sure why, but seeing her like this, guard down, frustration seeping through, made her feel more. Luca stole a glance at Bea as she massaged her temple, her frustration still lingering from the call. The powerful, poised woman he'd seen handling business with sharp precision a moment ago now sat with her eyes closed, exhaustion creeping through the cracks. For the first time since meeting her, she looked human. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. She let out a breath, opened her eyes, and turned towards him. "Just another day in paradise," Luca smirked. "That bad?" Bea shook her head. You wouldn't believe the number of people who can't do their jobs properly. Luca raised an eyebrow. You run $1 billion company, but you still have to micromanage. She huffed a quiet laugh, almost bitter. If I don't, everything falls apart. Sounds exhausting. You have no idea. For a moment, she just stared out the window, watching the Chicago skyline blur past them. Luca let the silence stretch, giving her space to think, to breathe. But then she turned back, her gaze sharp again. What about you? She asked. What's your story? Luca hesitated. Most people didn't ask, and if they did, they usually didn't care about the answer. But something in the way Bea looked at him made him think she actually wanted to know. Still, he kept it simple. Not much to tell. I drive, I work. I try to keep my kid from thinking I'm a failure. Her brows lifted slightly. You have a son? Lucas. 14. Luca tightened his grip on the wheel. Smart kid. Too smart for his own good sometimes. Bea studied him, her expression unreadable. And his mum? Luca let out a slow breath. Not in the picture. She didn't press, which he appreciated. Instead, she nodded, as if filing the information away for later. They pulled up to the next stop, another glass and steel skyscraper with tinted windows that reflected the overcast sky. Before Luca could say anything, Bea reached for the door handle. Wait here, she said. I won't be long. And then she was gone, disappearing into the building with the kind of confidence that turned heads. Luca exhaled, leaning back against his seat. He wasn't sure why, but something about Bea unsettled him. Not in a bad way, just in a way that made him think too much. He didn't like thinking too much. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Luca drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, debating whether to check his phone when the back door suddenly opened, and Ashley slid in, looking irritated. Drive, she said, voice clipped. Luca blinked. Where's Bea? Ashley let out a slow, controlled breath, as if trying to keep from snapping. She'll meet us at the next location. Just drive. Luca hesitated for half a second, then pulled away from the curb. He didn't ask questions. Bea had made it clear she ran her world on a different set of rules. But something about Ashley's tension made the air in the cab feel heavier. Everything okay? Luca asked carefully. Ashley gave a tight-lipped smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Everything is fine. Luca didn't buy it. Still, he kept quiet, focusing on the road. He had just turned onto Michigan Avenue when Ashley sighed and muttered, almost to herself, She does this all the time. Luca glanced at her in the mirror. Does what? Ashley hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing. But Luca had caught the slight edge in her voice. He didn't know what was going on, but he could sense it. Something between Ashley and Bea was off. They rode in silence until his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Lucas. Luca exhaled, pressing the hands-free button. Hey, kid. Where are you? Lucas's voice was careful, but Luca knew that tone. It was the one he used when he was holding something back. Working, Luca said. You good? A pause. Mr. Donovan came by. Luca's stomach tightened. He left another notice, Lucas continued, voice quieter now. Said we're out in 2 days. Luca gripped the wheel tighter, forcing his voice to stay calm. Don't worry about it. Lucas let out a hollow laugh. Yeah, sure. Luca hated this. Hated the weight in his son's voice, the exhaustion of a kid who was carrying too much. I'll handle it, Luca said. Like you handled it last time? Luca felt Ashley's gaze flick towards him, but he ignored it. Lucas, Luca said, gentler now. I got this. Silence. Then, finally, yeah, okay. The line went dead. Luca let out a slow breath, shoving down the frustration burning in his chest. He could feel Ashley watching him, but he didn't acknowledge it. When they pulled up to the next stop, she finally spoke. You should tell her. Luca frowned, turning to her. Tell who what? Ashley met his gaze, her expression unreadable. B. Luca huffed a quiet laugh. Tell her what? That I'm about to get kicked out of my apartment. That my son thinks I'm a failure. Yeah, I'm sure she'd love that conversation. Ashley tilted her head. You think she wouldn't care? Luca hesitated. He wasn't sure. Ashley smirked, shaking her head. You don't know her as well as you think you do. With that, she stepped out of the cab, leaving Luca alone with his thoughts. B slid into the front seat 20 minutes later, looking slightly annoyed but otherwise composed. Luca didn't ask what had happened. He had learned by now that B only talked when she wanted to. Instead, he pulled away from the curb, letting the city move around them. Everything good? He asked, keeping his voice neutral. B let out a breath, rolling her shoulders. Just another day in the Empire. Luca smirked. You say that like you don't enjoy it. She turned to him, one brow raised. Who says I do? He glanced at her, surprised. You built an empire, but you don't like ruling it? She was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, I like winning. I don't always like what it takes to win. There was something about the way she said it that made Luca think she wasn't just talking about business. He didn't push, but as they drove, he caught her watching him out of the corner of his eye. Not in the way Ashley had, measuring, assessing. No, B's gaze was different, curious. Luca exhaled, gripping the wheel tighter. He had a feeling he was getting pulled into something bigger than he had signed up for, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to stop it. Luca parked the car outside B's next meeting, letting the engine hum beneath his hands. The building in front of them was sleek, modern, one of those places where deals were made behind glass walls, and handshakes meant millions. He should have just sat there, waiting for her to leave. But something about the quiet between them felt different today. B hadn't moved to get out yet. Instead, she sat in the passenger seat, her fingers tracing the rim of a disposable coffee cup, her gaze distant. It was rare to see her still. Usually she was sharp, moving with purpose. But now, she looked unsettled. Luca finally broke the silence. Rough morning. B let out a breath, almost laughing under it. They're all rough. Some are just quieter about it. Luca smirked. That's some kind of billionaire wisdom? She turned to him, one brow raised. You think money makes things easier? He met her gaze. Doesn't it? B studied him for a second longer than comfortable, then smiled. Small, unreadable. That's what I used to think. She didn't elaborate, and Luca didn't press. Instead, she shifted, straightening her jacket as if shaking off whatever had been pulling at her. I won't be long. Ashley's meeting me inside. Luca gave a slight nod. I'll be here. B hesitated for a fraction of a second, so quick Luca might have missed it if he hadn't been watching her so closely. Then she pushed open the door and stepped out, disappearing through the tall glass doors. The moment she was gone, Luca let out a slow breath, raking a hand through his hair. He didn't know why, but being around B was getting more complicated. She was supposed to be just another passenger, another rich client, with a name that didn't matter. But every time she spoke, every time she looked at him like she was trying to figure him out, like maybe she wasn't used to not having people figured out, he felt something shift. He didn't like it, or maybe he did. Before he could analyze that too much, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen, already bracing himself. Lucas. Lucas swallowed hard, then answered. Hey, kid. His son's voice was flat. Donovan came by again. Luca closed his eyes, his grip tightening around the wheel. What did he say? Same thing. 2 days. And he wasn't exactly nice about it. Luca exhaled, willing himself to keep his voice steady. I'll take care of it. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, how? Luca's jaw locked. I just will. Another pause. Right. The line went dead before Luca could say anything else. He let the phone drop onto the passenger seat, his stomach twisting. He should have told Lucas about the job, about B, but what was he supposed to say? That he was driving around some millionaire hoping she'd keep him around long enough for him to scrape together the money to keep them in their apartment. It wasn't a solution. It was a stall. A few minutes later, the car door opened again, and Ashley slid into the back seat. She didn't say anything at first, just let out a sigh as she crossed her legs. Luca glanced at her through the mirror. B still inside? Ashley nodded, rubbing her temple. Yeah, meeting's dragging out. Something about the way she said it made Luca raise a brow. He debated letting it go. Then, you don't like this, do you? Ashley met his gaze in the mirror. Like what? Me, driving her. Ashley didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head, considering her words carefully. I don't dislike you, she said finally. I just don't trust you. Luca smirked. You always this friendly? I don't have the luxury of being friendly. Her voice was sharp, but there was something underneath it, something that wasn't just cold professionalism. Luca tapped his fingers against the wheel. You've worked for her a long time. Ashley nodded. You care about her. She held his gaze through the mirror. More than she knows. Something about the way she said it made Luca's smirk fade. Before he could say anything else, the building door swung open, and B emerged, her expression unreadable. Luca straightened, watching as she walked toward the car with a calm, calculated stride. But something was off. She was moving with that kind of deliberate slowness that wasn't natural. It was controlled. She slid into the passenger seat, exhaling. Ashley tensed immediately. What happened? B didn't answer right away. She just leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a brief second before responding. They want to pull the deal, she said, finally. Ashley's mouth pressed into a tight line. You knew this was coming. B nodded, eyes still closed. They don't think we have the numbers to back it. Ashley shook her head, clicking her tongue. That's a lie, and they know it. B's eyes opened again, and for the first time Luca saw something unfamiliar there. Doubt. They want me to prove it, B said quietly. Again. Luca didn't know the details, but he knew business enough to recognize what was happening. The people B was dealing with were testing her, pushing to see if she'd crack under the weight of their demands. Ashley leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. B, if you want out, now's the time. B blinked, her jaw tightening just slightly. Then she shook her head. No, she said firmly. Not yet. Ashley exhaled, but she didn't argue. Luca shifted, breaking the tension. Where to next? B hesitated. Then, finally, take me home. The drive was quiet, but this time the silence wasn't comfortable. Luca could feel it. Something had changed, something had cracked beneath the surface, and he had a feeling whatever it wasn't going to stay buried for long. Luca pulled into the underground parking garage of B's high-rise, the soft hum of the engine the only sound in the tight space. The silence between them was thick, heavy with things unsaid. B had barely spoken since getting into the car. She hadn't checked her phone, hadn't given a single passing glance at Ashley, who sat stiffly in the back seat. Instead, she just stared straight ahead, her fingers absently toying with the bracelet on her wrist. Luca wasn't used to seeing her like this. Uncertain. When he finally put the car in park, B let out a slow breath, like she had been holding it the entire ride. Ashley leaned forward. Do you want me to stay? B shook her head. No. Ashley didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. She just pressed her lips together and pushed open the door, stepping out into the dimly lit garage. Luca reached for the gear shift, ready to leave, when B suddenly spoke. Come inside. His hand froze. He looked over at her, confused. What? B's eyes met his, something unspoken flickering behind them. Just for a minute, Luca hesitated. This was a bad idea. It had been one thing to drive her around the city, to be part of her world while keeping a safe distance, but stepping into her home, that was different. That was crossing a line. But then she looked away, reaching for the door handle like she was about to take back the offer, and before he could stop himself, he heard his own voice. Okay. B stilled for half a second, then nodded. Okay. Luca let out a slow breath and followed her. The elevator ride was silent except for the soft hum of classical music playing through the speakers. B stood beside him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When the doors opened, Luca wasn't sure what he had been expecting. But this wasn't it. Her penthouse was sleek, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched out over the Chicago skyline. The city lights flickered against the glass, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Everything looked expensive, cold, like a perfectly curated magazine spread. But the moment B stepped inside, she let out a breath and kicked off her heels, leaving them discarded by the door. That small act made her seem more human than anything he had seen all day. Luca stepped inside cautiously, his boots feeling out of place against the pristine floors. B walked toward the kitchen, pulling a bottle of wine from the counter. "Do you want a drink?" Luca smirked. "Is this part of the job?" B shot him a look, but there was the slightest hint of amusement in her eyes. "It's just a drink." He hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." She poured 2 glasses and slid one toward him across the counter. Luca picked it up, studying her for a moment. "You want to tell me what's going on?" he finally asked. B let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "You're not one for small talk, are you?" "Not when I can tell something's wrong." B exhaled, tapping her fingers against the counter. "It's just business." Luca gave her a look. "Doesn't seem like just business." She sighed, swirling the wine in her glass. "The deal I've been working on for months. It's falling apart. Investors are backing out. They think I'm too much of a risk." Luca frowned. "Why?" B hesitated, then said quietly, "Because I built this company from nothing. And people like me, we're always one mistake away from losing everything." Luca studied her, something tightening in his chest. He had never thought about it that way. From the outside, people like B seemed untouchable, invincible. But now, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders had slumped just slightly now that they were behind closed doors, he realized she was fighting just as hard as he was. He took a slow sip of his wine. "They're idiots." B blinked, surprised. "Excuse me?" He shrugged. "They're idiots for doubting you." For a second, B just stared at him. Then, to his surprise, she let out a quiet laugh. "You say that like you actually know me." Luca met her gaze, his voice steady. "I think I'm starting to." Something shifted in the air between them. For the first time since stepping into her world, Luca felt like he wasn't just her driver. And from the way B was looking at him now, he wasn't sure she saw him that way anymore either. The night stretched on longer than Luca had expected. They talked about business, about life, about things Luca hadn't said out loud in years. Somewhere between the second glass of wine and the city lights glowing through the windows, B finally looked at him, something hesitant in her expression. "You don't belong in this world," she said softly. Luca smirked. "Yeah, I figured that out about 10 minutes into this job." B shook her head. "That's not what I mean." She set down her glass, studying him. "You're honest. You don't play games. You don't care about power or money, not the way people in my world do." Luca leaned against the counter, tilting his head. "And yet you invited me in." B didn't look away. "No one's ever just been kind to me, Luca. Not without wanting something in return." Her voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was heavy. Luca felt it sink into his bones. He held her gaze. Maybe you've just been looking in the wrong places. B's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something else. But before she could, her phone buzzed loudly against the counter, shattering the moment. She exhaled sharply and grabbed it, her expression tightening as she read the screen. Luca watched as her posture shifted, as the woman he had spent the last hour talking to disappeared, replaced by the hardened CEO once again. She put the phone down, rubbing her temple. I have to deal with this. Luca nodded, setting his own glass down. I should go. B hesitated for a fraction of a second, before nodding. He turned toward the door, but just as he reached for the handle, she spoke. Luca. He paused, looking back. B's eyes met his, something unreadable in them. Thank you. He gave her a small nod. Any time. And then he stepped out into the night, knowing nothing between them would ever be the same again. Luca sat in his cab, the city stretching out before him in endless streaks of red and white lights. The warmth from B's penthouse still clung to his skin, the sound of her voice lingering in his mind longer than he wanted to admit. He should have been driving, working, scraping together every last dollar before Donovan made good on his promise, but instead he just sat there. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He didn't have to look to know it was Lucas. With a slow exhale, he picked it up and answered. Yeah? You coming home? Lucas's voice was steady, but Luca could hear the underlying frustration. Yeah, kid. On my way. A pause. Then, you say that a lot. Luca closed his eyes for a moment, pinching the bridge of his nose. I mean it this time. All right, Lucas said, voice quieter now. See you soon. The line went dead, and Luca tossed the phone back onto the seat, letting his head fall against the headrest. He had 2 days. 2 days before everything fell apart, and for the first time, he wondered if he'd actually be able to stop it. Luca pushed open the door to the tiny apartment, the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. The place was dark except for the dim glow of the kitchen light. Luca sat at the small table, a half-eaten sandwich in front of him. He didn't look up when Luca walked in. Luca let out a slow breath. Hey. Lucas took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly. Hey. Lucas set his keys on the counter, glancing around. You do your homework. Lucas finally looked up, his expression unreadable. You got the rent money? Lucas' jaw tightened. I'm working on it. Lucas leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You always say that. Luca felt something snap inside him. And what do you want me to say, Lucas? That I've got it all figured out? That everything's fine? Lucas didn't flinch, but something in his eyes darkened. I just want the truth. Luca ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. I got a new job. Pays better. I just need a little more time. Lucas frowned. What job? Luca hesitated. Driving for someone. Lucas let out a short laugh, shaking his head. You mean a rich person? Luca narrowed his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Lucas looked at him then, really looked at him. It means I know how this ends. They use you until they don't need you anymore. Then what? Luca's stomach twisted. This is different. Lucas scoffed. Sure. Keep telling yourself that. Luca stared at his son, frustration and guilt colliding inside him. He didn't know how to fix this, how to make Lucas understand that he was trying. He was always trying. But before he could say anything else, Lucas pushed away from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm going to bed. And just like that, he was gone. Luca let out a slow breath, staring at the empty chair across from him. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out B's business card. His thumb traced over the raised lettering. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe this was just another bad bet. But right now, it was the only bet he had. The next morning, Luca was already parked outside B's building before she even called. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because sitting in that empty apartment, staring at the walls, waiting for Donovan to knock on his door, felt a lot worse than this. B stepped out of the lobby, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression unreadable. She barely acknowledged him as she slid into the passenger seat, murmuring into the receiver. "That's not an option. Number, I don't care what they're saying. I'm not backing down." Luca started driving, pretending not to listen. B rubbed her temple, closing her eyes for a brief second. "Fix it, Ashley." Then she hung up, exhaling sharply. Luca smirked. "Good morning to you, too." B shot him a look, but there was no real heat behind it. "You don't want to know." "Probably not." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Luca had gotten used to B's moods, the way she could go from ice-cold CEO to someone who, when she let herself, felt almost real. She tapped her fingers against the dashboard, staring out the window. "I assume Ashley gave you her speech." Luca raised a brow. "Which one?" B smirked. "The one where she warns you that working for me is a mistake." Luca shrugged. "Something like that." B tilted her head, watching him. "And yet, you're still here." Luca glanced at her, then back at the road. "Guess I'm bad at taking advice." Something flickered across B's face. Something Luca couldn't quite place. But before he could figure it out, her phone buzzed again. She let out a sharp sigh. "What now?" she answered, and Luca knew immediately from the shift in her expression that it wasn't good news. "What do you mean they pulled the funding?" Her voice was sharp, controlled, but there was something underneath it. Something dangerously close to panic. Luca kept driving, pretending he wasn't listening. B's grip on the phone tightened. "That was locked in weeks ago. They can't just—" She stopped listening. Then, her expression darkened. "Fine," she said, voice flat. "I'll handle it." She hung up, her jaw tight. Luca didn't ask, but after a long moment, B spoke. "My investors are pulling out," she said quietly. Luca frowned. "Why?" B let out a bitter laugh. "Because they think I'm too much of a risk. They always have." Luca's grip on the wheel tightened. "That's bull." B glanced at him, surprised. "You don't even know the details." "Don't have to," Luca said simply. "People like that. They don't bet on talent. They bet on control. You don't fit their mold, so they're trying to cut you out." B studied him, something unreadable in her gaze. "And what do you know about people like that?" Luca exhaled. "More than I want to." A beat of silence passed. Then, for the first time since she got in the car, B's shoulders relaxed just slightly. "I think I'm starting to like you, Luca." Luca smirked. "Careful. Might give Ashley a heart attack." B laughed, shaking her head. "That would almost be worth it." Luca chuckled, but then the moment passed, and the weight of reality settled back in. B had a battle ahead of her, and Luca, he had 2 days to keep his world from falling apart, and yet, for reasons he couldn't explain. Right now, all he could think about was her. Luca pulled up to the next stop, but B didn't move. She sat still, her hands resting on her lap, fingers lightly tapping against the fabric of her blazer. He stole a glance at her. "You gonna go in, or am I supposed to run your meeting for you?" B blinked, almost like she'd forgotten where they were. "Huh?" Luca smirked. "Thought you ran an empire. You're acting like you don't even want to step inside." She let out a short breath, her fingers stilling. "Maybe I don't." That surprised him. For as long as he had known her, B had been all sharp edges, controlled movements, unwavering focus. But today, she looked like she was balancing on a ledge no one else could see. "Then why are you doing this?" Luca asked. B turned to him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Because if I don't, someone else will, and they'll destroy everything I built." He studied her, searching her face. "That's what you care about?" The company? Her jaw tightened. It's all I have. Luca didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so much time assuming people like B had everything. But now, sitting next to her, he wasn't sure she had anything at all. She suddenly let out a breath, shaking her head like she was shaking off a thought. I should go. But she didn't move. Instead, she turned to him, hesitation flickering in her eyes. Would you? She stopped, catching herself. Luca frowned. What? She shook her head quickly. Nothing. Never mind. Luca's brows pulled together. B. She exhaled, staring out the window for a long moment. Then, finally, would you come inside? Luca blinked. Come inside. To what? Your corporate battlefield? B smirked slightly, but there was something nervous underneath it. Something like that. Luca hesitated. This wasn't his world. He didn't belong in conference rooms with people who had private jets and billion-dollar contracts. And yet, when B looked at him, waiting, something in his chest twisted. Against his better judgment, he sighed. Lead the way, boss. B didn't say anything, but the corner of her mouth twitched, something dangerously close to relief. She pushed open the door, and Luca followed. The moment they stepped into the glass-walled conference room, Luca knew exactly why B had been hesitating. The tension in the room was thick, like a storm rolling in just before it broke. 3 men in suits sat across from Ashley, their expressions unreadable. One of them looked up when B entered, barely masking his annoyance. You're late. B ignored him, moving to the head of the table. You're early. Luca leaned against the back wall, arms crossed. He wasn't sure why he was here, but something told him he was about to find out. Ashley shot him a glance but didn't say anything. B sat down, folding her hands in front of her. Let's skip the formalities. You want to pull the funding. Why? One of the men, a grey-haired executive with sharp features, leaned forward. It's not about wanting to. It's about necessity. Your projections aren't as strong as we expected. The risk is too high. B's expression didn't change. The risk was high when I started this company, and you were all happy to take a chance then. The man sighed, feigning patience. That was different. B tilted her head. How? A beat of silence. Then, you were different. Luca's jaw tightened. B sat still, unreadable, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled slightly against the table. She had known this was coming, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. Ashley leaned in. B's numbers are solid. The market is shifting, but she's already ahead of it. Pulling your investment now isn't just a mistake. It's a loss for you. The man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. That's optimistic. B finally moved, sitting back in her chair. So what is this really about? The second man, younger but just as calculated, folded his hands. You're a visionary, B, but visionaries don't always make the best leaders. We need stability, someone we can trust. Luca didn't need to be a business expert to read between the lines. They wanted her out. B stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she let out a small laugh, not the kind that meant she was amused, the kind that meant she was done. You think I built this company on luck? She asked, her voice smooth but edged with steel. The men exchanged glances, as if they weren't sure how to respond. You think I clawed my way to the top just to be taken down by a group of men who are scared of what happens when someone like me refuses to play by their rules? Luca exhaled through his nose. Damn. B leaned forward, and for the first time since she stepped into the room, she smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that sent warning signals through the room. I built this company, she said quietly, and I'll burn it to the ground before I let any of you take it from me. Silence. Then, slowly, the older man pushed back his chair, standing. Then, I suppose we're done here. B didn't move. Looks that way. The men gathered their things, moving toward the door without another word. Ashley let out a slow breath, rubbing her temple. Well, that was fun. Bea stood, straightening her blazer like she hadn't just threatened to dismantle everything she built. Then, finally, she turned to Luca. He smirked. So, that went well. Bea exhaled, pressing her fingers against her forehead. Let's go. Luca followed her out, not saying anything as they walked back toward the elevator. But just before the doors closed, Bea turned to him. Thanks for coming in. Luca raised a brow. Not sure I actually did anything. Bea studied him. You were there. And for some reason, that seemed to be enough. Luca leaned against the elevator wall, watching her. He had a feeling he wasn't just her driver anymore. And if he wasn't careful, he wasn't sure he'd want to be. Luca drove in silence, his fingers wrapped tight around the steering wheel as the city lights blurred past. The meeting had been a disaster, but Bea, she had walked out of that conference room like she had won. Like she hadn't just been threatened with losing everything. She sat beside him, her elbow resting on the edge of the window, her gaze locked onto the skyline. She wasn't speaking, and for once, Luca didn't feel the need to fill the space. She was thinking, and he was thinking about her. The way she'd held her ground, the way her voice had never wavered, even when those men had made it clear they wanted her out. Most people would have folded. Most people would have scrambled to negotiate. But Bea, she'd smiled. Luca exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. She was dangerous, not in the way he was used to, not in the way that got people hurt, but in the way that made people like him forget what lines they weren't supposed to cross. The soft hum of the radio filled the quiet, broken only when Bea finally spoke. They think I'll crack. Luca glanced at her. They think I'll give up, take the payout, and disappear. Her fingers tapped idly against her knee, a slow rhythmic beat. They don't understand that I don't lose. Luca smirked. Pretty sure they figured that out by the end. Bea let out a breath, a short huff of amusement. Then, after a beat, You were watching me. Luca blinked. What? In the meeting. She turned toward him now, one brow raised. You were watching me. Luca kept his eyes on the road. I was watching the train wreck. Mm-hmm. Silence stretched between them, but he could feel her gaze lingering. After a few seconds, Bea exhaled, sitting back against the seat. I don't know why I asked you to come in there with me. Luca smirked. Because I look good in a suit. She scoffed, but there was something softer in her voice when she said, because I trust you. Luca's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't know what to say to that. Trust wasn't something he was used to. Not in his world, not in hers. He pulled up to her building, letting the car idle. Bea didn't move to get out. Instead, she just stared straight ahead, something heavy settling into her features. He waited. Then, finally, she said, You ever feel like no matter how much you fight, no matter how much you prove yourself, people are just waiting for you to fail? Luca let out a slow breath, his chest tightening. Every day. Bea turned toward him, and for the first time, there was no steel in her gaze, no sharp edges, just something raw, something unguarded. And Luca knew, in that moment, that this wasn't just about business. This was about her, about the girl who had clawed her way out of whatever past she never talked about, about the woman who had built an empire from nothing, only to have men in suits try to take it from her like she hadn't bled for it. She wasn't afraid of losing money. She was afraid of being right, that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she built, it would never be enough. Luca exhaled through his nose, gripping the wheel. Then don't let them win. Bea stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, her lips curved, just slightly. You always this dramatic, Luca smirked. Only when I'm right. She huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. I should go. But she didn't move. Neither did he. The air between them was heavy, thick with something neither of them wanted to name. Finally, B reached for the door handle, hesitating just for a second. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Good night, Luca." And just like that, she was gone. Luca sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat beside him. Then, with a quiet curse, he threw the car into gear and drove off. By the time Luca got home, the apartment was dark. Lucas was already in bed, but Luca knew he wasn't asleep. He stood outside his son's door for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of music playing from his phone. Then, with a slow breath, he knocked. Silence. Then, "It's open." Luca pushed the door open, leaning against the frame. "You okay?" Lucas didn't look up from his screen. "Are you?" Luca let out a short laugh. "Touché." Lucas sighed, setting his phone down. "You still have a plan, right?" Luca hesitated. Then finally, "Yeah." Lucas studied him, searching his face for something. "Do you actually believe that?" Luca swallowed hard. "I have to." Lucas exhaled, looking away. "Okay." Lucas stepped back into the hallway. "Get some sleep, kid." Lucas didn't answer, but as Luca closed the door, he heard a quiet, "You too." Lucas stared at the dark ceiling that night, B's words looping through his mind. "Because I trust you." He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he wanted to get out. Lucas' phone buzzed before the sun even rose. He groaned, rubbing his eyes as he reached for it. The name flashing on the screen made his stomach tighten. B. He sat up, glancing at the clock. 5:42 a.m. Nothing good ever happened at this hour. He hesitated, then answered, "Didn't take you for a morning person." B's voice was sharp, but there was something frayed at the edges. "I need you to pick me up." Lucas swung his legs off the couch, suddenly more awake. "What's wrong?" A pause, then softer, "I just need to get out of here." Luca frowned, but he didn't ask questions. "On my way." He grabbed his keys and left. When he pulled up outside B's building, she was already there, standing at the curb in a coat that looked like it had been thrown on in a hurry. She had no makeup on, her blonde hair slightly tousled, like she hadn't slept. Luca's chest tightened. He had never seen her like this. She climbed in without a word, pulling the seatbelt across her body before leaning her head against the window. Luca glanced at her. "You gonna tell me what's going on? Or do I just start driving until we hit the ocean?" B let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Tempting." Luca waited. Finally she exhaled, shutting her eyes for a moment. "I just couldn't be there anymore." Luca wasn't sure what she meant. The apartment, the company, her entire world. "Where to?" he asked instead. She was quiet for a second, then, "Anywhere but here." Luca nodded and pulled away from the curb. They drove in silence, the city still waking up around them. The streets were mostly empty, the early morning haze softening the edges of the skyline. Luca didn't know where he was going, but something told him B didn't care. She just needed to breathe. After a while she spoke again, her voice quieter now. "You ever feel like you built something so big, you don't know how to stop it?" Luca glanced at her. "You thinking about stopping?" B let out a slow breath. "I don't know." Luca tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. "I thought you said you don't lose." B turned her head, looking at him. "I don't." "Then why do you sound like you already did?" She exhaled sharply, turning back to the window. "You ask too many questions." Luca smirked. "You keep calling me, that's on you." B huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "I shouldn't." Luca raised a brow. "Why not?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched the city blur past, her fingers playing absently with the cuff of her coat. Finally, she said, "Because you make me feel like I don't have to fight all the time." Luca's grip tightened on the wheel. She wasn't looking at him, but she didn't need to. The words hung between them. Heavy, electric. Luca swallowed, keeping his eyes on the road. And that's a bad thing? B exhaled. It's dangerous. Luca let that sit for a second before saying, For who? B didn't answer. They kept driving. Eventually, Luca pulled off onto a side street near the water, parking by a quiet stretch of the lakefront. The city felt far away here, the morning air crisp and clean. B stared out at the water, something unreadable in her expression. Luca leaned back against his seat. So, you gonna tell me what's actually going on? Or do I have to guess? B let out a breath, her fingers tightening in her lap. The board is meeting today, she finally said. They're going to vote on whether I stay. Luca frowned. And, she said, voice tight, I don't know which way it's gonna go. Luca turned fully toward her now. You're telling me you built this company from the ground up, made them a fortune, and they're still thinking about pushing you out? B's lips pressed together. That's how this world works, Luca. The second they think you're more trouble than you're worth, they find a way to get rid of you. Luca exhaled through his nose. Then why aren't you in that meeting fighting for it? B let out a small laugh, but it wasn't amused. Because I'm tired of fighting. Luca watched her carefully. She was always in control, always 3 steps ahead. But right now, she looked exhausted, not just from today, from years of clawing her way up, from carrying the weight of something too heavy for one person alone. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time, she was wondering if it was worth it. Luca exhaled, running a hand through his hair. B. She turned to him. He hesitated, then finally said, What happens if you let it go? B's eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe. Or realization. I don't know, she admitted. Luca nodded slowly. Maybe it's time to find out. B swallowed, looking away. I don't know how to be anything else. Luca's chest tightened. Then maybe it's time to figure out who you are without all of it. B stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she exhaled. They sat in silence, the waves lapping gently against the shore, the city humming quietly behind them. Finally, B said, Stay with me today. Luca hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because he did. And that was dangerous. But when he looked at her, sitting there, staring out at the water like she wasn't sure who she was anymore, he knew there was only one answer. Yeah, he said quietly. I'll stay. And just like that, something shifted between them. Something neither of them could take back. The air inside the car was thick with something unspoken. Luca could feel it pressing in, settling between them like a weight neither of them wanted to name. B sat quietly, her gaze still fixed on the water, fingers curled lightly around the edge of her coat. She hadn't moved since he said he'd stay. He should have asked her what she wanted to do next, should have told her they needed a plan. But instead, he just sat there, watching her. Finally, B exhaled and turned to him. I don't know how to do this. Luca frowned. Do what? Her lips parted slightly like she was about to answer, but then she shook her head, letting out a soft, humorless laugh. Never mind. Luca studied her carefully, trying to read between the lines. You don't know how to lose. B's jaw tightened. I don't lose, she said quietly, almost to herself. Luca tilted his head. Then why do you look like you already did? B's gaze snapped to his, sharp and searching, like she was trying to figure out what he saw when he looked at her. Luca held her stare, steady, because for the first time since he met her, he wasn't looking at the woman who built an empire. He was looking at the woman who was terrified to let it go. B swallowed, breaking eye contact first. I don't want to go back there. Luca exhaled. Then don't. She turned to him again. a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. And do what, Luca? Walk away from everything? Just disappear? He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearm on the steering wheel. What if you did? Bea let out a short laugh, shaking her head. I can't just disappear. Why not? Luca asked. Bea blinked, like she wasn't sure how to answer. Then, finally, she whispered, because I don't know who I am without all of it. Luca felt something twist in his chest. Bea Harrington, the woman who could command a room, who could make grown men cower with a single look, was afraid of one thing: herself. Luca exhaled, running a hand through his hair. So what happens if they vote you out? Bea pressed her lips together. I don't know. Luca smirked slightly. That's got to be a first. She shot him a look, but there wasn't any real bite behind it. He softened. Listen, I get it. This company, it's your whole life. It's who you've been for years. But Bea, you built it once. You could do it again. Bea let out a slow breath, leaning her head back against the seat. I don't know if I want to. Luca's brows pulled together. Then why are you still fighting? Bea closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, turning her head slightly to face him. Because it's all I know how to do. Luca sat back, watching her. She looked tired, not just physically, but in the way someone looks when they've been running for so long, they don't remember what it feels like to stop. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally Luca asked, Do you want to go back? Bea hesitated. For the first time she didn't have an answer. They didn't go back. Not right away. Instead, Luca drove, letting the city fade behind them. Bea didn't ask where they were going. She didn't question it. Didn't pull out her phone. Didn't demand to be dropped off at her office, so she could face the board like the warrior she always was. She just sat there, silent, watching the world pass by. Eventually, Luca pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that had peeling vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. Bea frowned as he put the car in park. What is this? Luca smirked. Breakfast. She gave him a look. It's almost noon. Then it's brunch. Bea huffed, shaking her head, but there was the faintest hint of amusement in her eyes. Luca pushed open his door. Come on, Harrington. Let's see if you can survive being a normal person for an hour. Bea hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped out of the car. The diner smelled like fresh coffee and bacon grease. The kind of smell that wrapped around you, sinking into your clothes and your bones. Luca slid into a booth by the window, and after a moment, Bea followed. A waitress appeared, pouring 2 cups of coffee without asking. Luca nodded in thanks, while Bea hesitated before wrapping her hands around the mug, as if trying to absorb its warmth. You don't do this often, do you? Luca mused. Bea lifted a brow. Drink coffee? Sit in a place like this. Take a break. Bea exhaled, her fingers tightening around the mug. Not really, Luca smirked. Let me guess. Your idea of a break is answering emails with one hand while drinking an overpriced smoothie with the other. Bea shot him a flat look. I don't drink smoothies. Luca chuckled. Of course not. The waitress came back, pen poised. What can I get you? Luca glanced at Bea. You trust me? Bea's eyes narrowed slightly. No. Luca grinned, turning to the waitress. 2 stacks of pancakes, extra syrup, and 2 sides of bacon. Bea sighed, setting down her coffee. That's a heart attack on a plate. That's happiness on a plate. Bea shook her head, but when the food arrived a few minutes later, she didn't hesitate to take a bite. Luca watched as she chewed, her expression carefully neutral. Then, finally, she swallowed and said, Okay. That's not terrible. Luca smirked. Told you. They ate in silence for a while, the clinking of silverware filling the space between them. Then, out of nowhere, B said, "Thank you." Luca looked up. "For what?" B's eyes met his. "For this. For not pushing me. For staying." Luca held her gaze, something warm settling in his chest. Then, softly, "Anytime." B exhaled, looking out the window, her shoulders just a little more relaxed than before. Luca didn't know what would happen when they went back. Didn't know if B would walk into that boardroom and fight, or if she would finally let go. But for right now, in this tiny diner with bad coffee and good pancakes, she wasn't B Harrington, CEO. She was just B. And for the first time, Luca wasn't sure if he wanted her to go back. Luca leaned back in the booth, his coffee cooling in front of him as B stared down at her plate, absently pushing a piece of pancake around with her fork. The diner had started to fill up with the late breakfast crowd. Families, retirees, construction workers grabbing a quick bite before their next job. For a woman who commanded boardrooms, B looked strangely out of place in a setting so ordinary. And yet, for the first time since he met her, she looked at ease. "You keep playing with your food like that, and the syrup's gonna start fighting back," Luca said, smirking. B gave him a look but didn't pull away from her thoughts. "What time is it?" Luca glanced at his phone. "Almost 1. She let out a slow breath, setting her fork down. "They've probably voted by now." Luca studied her, waiting. Finally he said, "And?" B hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "And I don't know if I care." Luca raised a brow. "That's new." B let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "I've spent the last decade fighting for every inch, every deal, every ounce of respect, and now—" She trailed off, glancing out the window. The sky had cleared from the morning haze, the sunlight casting a soft glow over the street outside. Luca tilted his head. "You ever stop to think that maybe you were fighting for something you don't even want anymore?" B turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "What if that's true?" Luca leaned forward slightly, resting his forearm on the table. "Then maybe it's time to ask yourself who you are without it." B's lips parted slightly, like she wanted to argue. But then she shut her mouth, exhaling slowly. She was scared. Not of losing the company, but of what came next. Luca's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen. Lucas. His stomach tightened. He picked up, keeping his voice steady. "Yeah?" Lucas didn't waste time. "Donovan's here." Lucas' jaw locked. "What?" "He's outside," Lucas said, voice tight. "Said if we don't have the money by tonight, we're out." Luca exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "I'll be there soon." "Yeah," Lucas muttered. "You always say that." The line went dead. Luca stared at the phone, his pulse hammering. B was watching him, her gaze sharp. "Everything okay?" Luca forced a smirk. "Depends on your definition." B didn't blink. "What happened?" Luca leaned back, shaking his head. "Nothing I can't handle." B's eyes narrowed slightly, like she could see straight through him. "You need money." Luca's stomach twisted. B didn't ask. She stated it. Luca let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers against the table. "Everyone needs money." B tilted her head, studying him. "How much?" Luca frowned. "What?" Her gaze didn't waver. "How much do you need?" Luca let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Not happening." B arched a brow. "You'd rather what? Keep pretending everything's fine until it falls apart?" Luca exhaled sharply. "I don't take handouts." B leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. "Luca, I mean it." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. B studied him, something flickering behind her expression. Then, slowly, she sat back. Luca could still feel her watching him, but she didn't push. Instead, she reached for her coffee and took a slow sip. Luca exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. I should go. B nodded, but there was something in her eyes that told him this conversation wasn't over. Luca threw a few bills on the table, then stood. B followed, pulling her coat tighter around her as they stepped outside. The air was cooler now, a crisp breeze rolling in from the lake. Luca unlocked the car, but just as he reached for the door, B spoke. I can help you. Luca froze. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. B's expression was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. You don't have to do this alone. Luca let out a slow breath, shaking his head. I do. B's lips pressed together, frustration flashing in her gaze. Why? Luca swallowed hard. Because that's the only way it means something. Silence stretched between them. Then, B exhaled, crossing her arms. You're so damn stubborn. Luca smirked slightly. You just noticing that now? B shook her head, but there was something almost fond in the way she looked at him. For a second, Luca thought she might say something else, but then she just sighed, opening the passenger door. Luca followed, sliding into the driver's seat. As they pulled onto the road, B turned toward him. Let me at least drive you home. Luca raised a brow. You planning on carrying me there? B rolled her eyes. Just let me do this. No strings attached. Luca hesitated. Then, finally he sighed. Fine. B didn't say anything. But as they drove through the city, Luca could feel it. Something between them had shifted, and he wasn't sure either of them were ready for what came next. Luca pulled up to his building, gripping the wheel a little too tightly. B sat beside him, silent, but aware, her gaze flicking between him and the rundown apartment complex with the flickering streetlight out front. She didn't say anything, but he knew what she was thinking. This wasn't her world, and for the first time since she stepped into his car, she was seeing exactly what that meant. Luca let out a slow breath. Thanks for the ride. B's fingers drummed against her thigh. You sure you don't want me to come in? Luca gave her a look. What? You planning on negotiating with my landlord? B smirked slightly, but the concern in her eyes didn't fade. If that's what it takes. Luca huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. I got it. B exhaled, pressing her lips together. I know you do. She didn't sound convinced. Luca pushed open the door, stepping out. He expected her to drive off, to leave him to deal with the mess he was in. But B didn't move. She just watched. Luca exhaled, raking a hand through his hair before making his way up the steps. The moment he reached the second floor, he saw Lucas. His son was sitting on the ground outside their apartment door, his arms wrapped around his knees. Lucas' stomach tightened. Lucas looked up, his expression unreadable. He changed the lock. Lucas swallowed hard, rubbing a hand over his face. Damn it. Lucas stood, dusting himself off. Told you this was going to happen. Luca clenched his jaw. Where's your stuff? Lucas shrugged, like it didn't matter. Inside. Luca let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He knocked on the door next to theirs, waiting. A few seconds later, Mrs. Patel, their elderly neighbor, cracked it open. Her face softened when she saw them. Luca, I'm so sorry, dear. He came by an hour ago, told me not to let you back in. Luca swallowed back his frustration. It's okay. Did he take anything? She shook her head. I don't think so. He just locked it up. Luca nodded, running a hand through his hair. Thanks, Mrs. Patel. Lucas shifted beside him. Now what? Luca didn't answer right away. He didn't have an answer. He could call Mike, crash at his place for the night, but before he could say anything, another voice cut in. You coming or not? Luca turned. B was standing at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed, her gaze locked onto his. Lucas frowned. Who's that? Luca let out a slow breath. That's my boss. Lucas blinked. Your boss? B tilted her head. You want to stand in the hallway all night, or are you getting in the car? Luca hesitated. Lucas did not. The kid grabbed his backpack from the floor and started walking down the steps. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm leaving. Luca sighed. B smirked. Smart kid. Luca shook his head, but he followed. B's penthouse was the exact opposite of everything Luca had ever known, where his place was small, lived in, cluttered with years of trying to make ends meet. B's was vast, spotless, untouched. Lucas stepped inside, his eyes widening slightly. You live here? B set her coat on the back of a chair. Sometime, Lucas whistled, running a hand over the marble countertop. Not bad. Lucas shot him a look. Don't touch anything. B smirked. Relax, he's fine. Lucas turned toward her, crossing his arms. So, you're the reason my dad's been acting weird. Luca groaned. Lucas! B just raised a brow. Weird how? Lucas shrugged. I don't know, he's been working a lot, distracted, and now apparently he has a boss that picks him up and drives him home. Luca let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. You're making this weird, kid. Lucas ignored him. So what's the deal with you two? B smirked. That's a great question. Luca shot her a look. Don't encourage him. B just chuckled, walking toward the kitchen. You hungry? Lucas blinked, like he hadn't expected the offer. Yeah. B nodded. Good. There's food in the fridge. Help yourself. Lucas hesitated, then glanced at Luca. Luca sighed. Go ahead. Lucas didn't need to be told twice. The moment he disappeared into the kitchen, Luca turned to B. You didn't have to do this. B arched a brow. Didn't I? Luca exhaled. I'll figure something out. B stepped closer, tilting her head. Why is it so hard for you to accept help? Luca clenched his jaw. Because nothing comes without a price. B studied him for a long moment. Then, softly. I'm not asking for anything, Luca. Luca swallowed hard. He wanted to believe her. But people like B, they didn't just do things out of the kindness of their hearts. At least, that's what he had always thought. B let out a slow breath, crossing her arms. You can stay here for as long as you need. Luca huffed. Yeah, because that won't be weird. B smirked. You're already here. Luca shook his head, dragging a hand down his face. I'll figure something out tomorrow. B's gaze softened. Get some sleep, Luca. He exhaled, nodding slightly. Yeah. But as he turned to walk away, B's voice stopped him. And Luca? He glanced back. B held his stare, something unreadable in her expression. You're not alone. Luca's throat tightened. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure how to respond. So, instead, he just nodded. And for the first time, he let himself believe it might be true. Luca barely slept. The silence of B's penthouse was unnerving. No creaky pipes, no neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, no sound of city traffic filtering in through a cracked window. Just space. Too much of it. He sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. He should have been relieved. He and Lucas had a roof over their heads, at least for tonight. But instead, all he could think about was how temporary it all felt. B said there were no strings. But Luca had spent his entire life learning that nothing came without a cost. At some point, exhaustion pulled him under. When he woke up, the sun was already rising, warm light spilling through the massive windows. He blinked, sitting up, stretching his sore muscles. The smell of coffee drifted through the air. Luca rubbed his face, standing and making his way toward the kitchen. B was already there, leaning against the counter, her phone in one hand, a coffee cup in the other. She was still in her silk robe, her hair slightly messy, like she had just rolled out of bed, She looked softer, like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for once. She glanced up when she saw him, arching a brow. "You look terrible." Luca smirked, running a hand through his hair. "You really know how to boost a guy's confidence." B smirked, sipping her coffee. "Rough night. Let's just say I'm not used to sleeping in places that don't feel like a shoebox." B chuckled, setting her phone down. "You'll adjust." Luca hesitated before stepping closer, leaning against the island. "Any news?" B didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she sighed, setting her cup down. "They voted me out." Luca stilled. B let out a short breath, but it wasn't surprised. If anything, it sounded like she had already made peace with it. "I thought you'd be more upset," Luca said carefully. B's lips twitched, something unreadable in her gaze. "I thought I would be too." Luca studied her. "And," B exhaled, "and I think I feel relieved." Luca frowned slightly. "Relieved?" B nodded, almost like she was still trying to convince herself. "I spent 10 years building that company, Luca. 10 years fighting, proving myself over and over again. And now that it's over, I don't feel lost." She looked up at him, something shifting in her expression. "I feel free." Luca didn't know what to say to that. For weeks, B had been carrying this weight, this battle, like she didn't know how to exist without it. But now, standing in front of him in nothing but a robe, sipping her coffee like she had nowhere to be, she looked lighter. She looked happy. B let out a breath, shaking her head with a small smile. "I don't have to answer to anyone anymore. I don't have to prove anything. For the first time in a long time, I get to decide what happens next." Luca smirked. "And what happens next?" B tilted her head, considering him. "That's the fun part. I don't know." Luca exhaled, watching her. For a woman who had spent her entire life controlling every outcome, that was a big statement. B reached for her phone again, unlocking the screen. "But first, I have a call to make." Luca raised a brow. "To who?" B smirked, tapping her screen. "To the investors." Luca frowned. "Didn't they just vote you out?" B nodded, bringing the phone to her ear. "Exactly." Luca leaned against the counter, watching as B's expression shifted into something sharp. Dangerous. A few seconds later, someone answered. B smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Good morning, gentlemen. I assume you're expecting this call." Luca crossed his arms, listening. B's voice was smooth, confident. "I'd like to remind you that even though I'm no longer CEO, I still own 35% of the company. And unless you'd like me to start selling my shares to your competitors, I suggest we discuss how this transition is going to work." Luca let out a low whistle. "Damn." B shot him a wink, pacing slightly as she continued talking. Luca had no idea what she was planning, but one thing was clear. B. Harrington wasn't done playing the game, and for the first time, Luca wasn't sure if he wanted to stop her. Luca leaned against the balcony railing, staring out at the Chicago skyline as the city pulsed beneath him. The night air was crisp, the hum of traffic distant but steady. Inside, he could hear the soft clinking of glasses, the faint murmur of conversation. B was still on the phone, wrapping up whatever power move she had decided to make today. He exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. It had been a long few days. No, a long few weeks. Everything had changed so fast. One minute, he was barely scraping by, counting the hours until eviction. The next, he was standing in a penthouse he didn't belong in, next to a woman who had upended his entire world. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to leave. The sliding door opened behind him, followed by the soft sound of B's bare feet against the deck. "Investors caved," she said, setting her phone on the railing. Luca smirked. "Of course they did." B huffed a quiet laugh, crossing her arms as she leaned next to him. "I still own a third of the company. They realized pretty quickly that trying to push me out completely would be a mistake. Luca glanced at her. So what now? B was quiet for a moment, then exhaled. I walk away, on my terms. Luca raised a brow. B turned to him, tilting her head slightly. What? He studied her for a beat, then smirked. I think you like the fight more than you let on. B scoffed, shaking her head. Not true. Luca just looked at her. She rolled her eyes. Okay, maybe a little. Luca chuckled. Thought so. B turned back to the skyline, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. I don't know what comes next, Luca. For the first time in a long time, I don't have a plan. Luca leaned against the railing, watching her. Scary. B swallowed, then nodded. Yeah. Luca exhaled, looking back out at the skyline. Yeah. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just them. After a moment, B spoke again, her voice softer now. You're not staying, are you? Luca's grip tightened on the railing. He knew this was coming. He had been avoiding it, pushing it back, letting himself exist in this strange, impossible bubble where he and B lived in the same world. But they didn't. Not really. Luca sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Lucas and I need a place of our own. B nodded, like she already knew the answer before he said it. Where will you go? Luca smirked. You offering me another penthouse? B laughed softly, shaking her head. I don't think you'd take it. Luca smirked. You're learning. B exhaled, shifting closer to him, her shoulder just barely brushing his. You don't have to disappear, you know. Luca looked at her. B held his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. You could stay in my life, just not as my driver. Luca's chest tightened. He wanted to. Hell, he wanted to more than he had wanted anything in a long time. But Luca knew how this went. He and B, they were from two different worlds. Eventually, the gravity of those differences would pull them apart. Luca let out a slow breath, offering her a small, lopsided smile. We'll see. B searched his face, like she wanted to argue. But then, finally, she just nodded. And maybe that was enough. For now. Luca turned back to the skyline, feeling the weight of everything settle in his chest. B leaned against him, just slightly. Not enough for it to mean anything. But just enough for it to mean everything.